Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I hope everyone is okay today. I have a really great guest. Rob Illinois gave me the heads up for this particular guest, and I'm glad that he did. I have with me Bev Harris. She is an author and an election integrity, you can say, researcher. And she's been doing this for a while, and she has come up to some I guess you could say disturbing conclusions about our electoral system. You guys know how I feel about our electoral politics. I think ultimately what we have in order to determine who leads is an electoral process. If that electoral process is being subverted, then democracy itself is being undermined and subverted. After all, if you're not putting the person in office that your country is trying to vote in office, then what do you have for the standpoint of your political space and your even governance? Even is it even self-governance at that point? And beyond that, going a little further than that, it's how and beyond that, how do you even know that the person that you voted in office was the person that was supposed to win that race if there's no transparency within the process that you're using? So, Bev, I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this, and please give the audience a hello.
Well, hello. It's great to be here. You're doing great work.
Thank you. And did I address you correctly? An election
Yes.
integrity researcher and author.
Yes.
Okay. Now, question, and I'm going to try to keep this concise, even though you and I have been talking for like 10 minutes or 15 minutes before this even started. Um, what is black box voting? Your book is named Black Box Voting. What does that mean? What does the term refers to? And this is just contextual information. I know most of the audience knows it, but just in case somebody stumbles on the video and have no idea what I'm talking about, I want to give them a framework with which to understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sure. A black box is in computer systems, it's generally something you can't look inside. In other words, you can only determine what it's actually doing by looking at its output, and you can't see how it's actually operating inside. So, black box voting would be you get the output, here's the result, but you can't see, and you can see sometimes who showed up at the polls, although even that you can't see a lot anymore with absentee voting. You just get an output, and you don't get to ever look inside to see how that output was derived.
Essentially, a bunch of people go, they place their vote, they leave, and you have to assume that the vote tally that was given is the actual vote tally. But therein lies the problem that you're assuming you don't necessarily know. And if you're talking about an electoral system where you are choosing who are the elected leaders of that particular country, all things being equal, you should want to know. Not just want to know, you should need to
Oh,
know.
absolutely. Yes. You know that if you can't authenticate it, if it's not transparent and the public cannot authenticate it, then people are going to use that to take power. Power
And
is money, and money is power.
and by the way, from logically, from a percentage standpoint, you would expect it. It's almost like Catholic priests.
Of
It's
course.
like no one wants to look at Catholic priests, and then when you look under the skirt, it's like, oh my God, they're having sex with kids. Well, the fact that these guys were supposed to be religious, the fact that these guys were supposed to be these pinnacles of virtues, kind of left people not looking behind this sheet, despite the fact that people might say things or something comes up here or there. You find out it's systemic, but it's systemic because no one was looking. Like the
Right.
very the very fact that there was a certain patina of ethereal cosmic rightness. Um, it precluded people from actually asking the secondary question of, well, wait a minute, is that right? Our voting system to me is kind of the same way. Media and people tend to just take it as an act of God, that it's perfectly okay.
Yeah.
This is the point that the moment,
Faith-based voting.
yeah, yeah, right,
Faith-based
faith
voting.
voting. I'm going to make this vote. I'm not going to get an output, and I'm just going to assume that the vote is what it is. And
Right.
that,
It's a ridiculous concept, and it flies in the face of human nature. I mean, you have one of the things people don't think about is what the incentives are to actually steal an election. And they think, oh, it's about Democrats or Republicans.
no,
No,
it's not.
it's about money.
Right.
It's about money. Um, if you look at local politics, even a small local jurisdiction has budgets of 50, $100 million at a time. And these are contracts that are let out, and people make money from having those contract decisions signed off in their behalf. So at every level, there's a huge, huge incentive, a money incentive, as well as an incentive of belief.
For the person getting in office. And just so we're clear, just so we can put an example on that, there are a few. The Foxconn thing in Wisconsin, but like that we were going to give them billions of dollars. The same thing with the Amazon thing in New York. They were going to get 2 campuses. They were going to get billions of dollars from those jurisdictions nearby.
And somebody needs to sign off on that. And so you want to have control over either the person who signs off or the person who appoints the person who signs off on it. This is actually, before the show, I mentioned to you, I'm now working on 2 areas of research. One is elections. And because in researching the voting machines, I realized that what I was looking at was not about voting machines, it was about corruption. That was the underlying problem. I'm working on actually describing and quantifying how corruption works in the first world countries. In the United States, it's a little different. Everyone thinks, well, we're not corrupt here. It's only corrupt over in Africa, or in South America, it isn't us. It couldn't be us, whereas actually, we probably are more corrupt, but it's more nuanced, it's more lawyerly. And by the way, the third world countries have to launder their money in the first world countries. So the bankers and accountants are part of the corruption, and they come from the first world countries.
When we were talking earlier, I was kind of making this point of, this wink and a nod that any sane person looking at the process says there's something wrong here. Like, it looks corrupt on its face. 90% of the races that are won by the side with the most cash, which gives all the incentive of the world that the main thing is to get the most cash. And they're not trying to win these positions because these positions pay so well. They're trying to win these positions for the influence and, like you said, for the budgets that these guys are able to manipulate once they get into office. And just for another point, we were kind of making this point about speeches. Like the Clinton Foundation, where she would take money for a speech, and it would be like $250,000, an insane amount of money for a speech, and it would be speech after speech after speech after speech. And it's like, what are they paying for? It's like they've seen you give them speech once before. They know everything that you're going to say. This is one hell of a speech. But what you realize is this is access. This is a way of paying somebody off without necessarily just saying, here's a bunch of blunt cash. But it is a bunch of blunt cash. When I call, you better pick up if you want this blunt cash again, or if you want a job, or if you want some kind of political, like all incentives of the world are for them to try to find ways of gaming the system in this way. It's shocking that people don't consider that they're probably gaming the system.
That's because it's like a religion. We're supposed to be, it's almost considered, in fact, we talked a little bit about media narrative. We are basically being told that we are somehow unpatriotic or rude or crazy if we actually want to ask any questions and assess things for ourselves. I have 2 websites now, blackboxvoting.org, which deals with election integrity issues, and a new one that I'm just now filling out, bevharris.com. And that's going to deal with the corruption issues. And the second article on that right now gives a skeletal outline of money laundering techniques. When I started working on election systems, I actually saw money laundering happening, money laundering right in front of me. And I didn't understand what I was looking at. I just thought, well, that looks weird. Why are they doing it that way? For example, in a voting machine contract, they would say, Diebold would say, well, we're going to sell you this contract for voting machines for $10 million, and $4 million of it is a training fee that we're going to provide training. And then they would back out the training later on and not do the training. And they did that in 2 counties in a row. And then I had someone inside Diebold in accounting contact me, a whistleblower, and he said, this is how they're laundering the money. And I still didn't understand it. I'm like, well, I don't get how you do that. So I had to learn how money laundering works. And there's a number of different techniques that are used. And in my corruption side, I'll be referring back to those over and over as we see examples, because we don't catch corruption in our public offices because we don't know what we're looking for.
So let's get to that part. Elections. So are the elections in the United States fraudulent? And I don't mean this nonsense that the Republicans are talking about of, there are 3 million Mexicans invaded the country and voted in California. None of that stuff. I mean,
The
And,
counting.
I know when Sanders ran, this was when this issue became something for me. This was when it became this like, well, wait a minute, that looks weird. That looks a little strange.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know some of it is gaming in a political sense of, I'm going to shut down polling locations. I'm going to make it difficult for people to vote.
Right.
But what you're talking about as election fraud goes beyond gaming the system in that way. You're talking about gaming the system with direct access or direct manipulation of the vote tallies at the end. And before people say, well, wait a minute, that's crazy. If you look at the Sanders votes, all of the votes were off in many of these states. Not all, I can't say all, but many of the votes were off by a certain percentage, meaning from an exit tally versus the votes themselves. People seemingly will go into a vote and then come out and lie to the person who's standing outside who's doing the exit vote. This is such a bizarre
That's what we were told. That was the narrative, right? They come out and they lie.
those dirty Sanders voters just got up there, or those Hillary Clinton voters were so ashamed of that vote that they just came out and lied and said they voted for Sanders. And so the exit tally was always off. And it was that way in like, what, 8 different states. And the Republican tally wasn't off, just the Sanders and the Clinton tally was off.
Right.
And it got so bad that in California, they didn't even do it. Like the disparities between them was so off. I remember when New York came out and there was this chance, this was this upswell of like, oh God, if Sanders wins New York, what does it mean? What does it mean? Whisper a dream, all that stuff. And the Sanders lost New York by like punishingly lost it, which flew in the face of all the polls that were leading up to it, and even flew in the face of the exit tally that came out. But this kept happening over and over and over and over again. People just said it just happens that way. Now, if this was a third world country, people would have said the election were fraudulent.
In fact, one of the articles that I'm working on right now on election stuff is a very controversial and many say fraudulent election in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the reason I'm going to do a story on it is because some of the things are the same thing that we saw happen in the US. And we're so quick to say, oh, well, look, that was obviously fraudulent, and not mention that the same things happened in several locations here in 2018.
We do that. I'm always enamored by that. Like, the cynical distance that you get when you can look at somewhere else and say, oh yeah, that's a fraud, but here, not so much. It could be the same thing. And they still wouldn't see the disparities. Like, they don't see the oddity. It's like a dream versus reality. It's like, yeah, the same mechanisms hold true in the dream state. Everything that you're experiencing in reality is also holds true in the dream state. And yet never make the disparity between the two of saying, well, maybe those things are similar, or maybe those things are the same, or the faculties are the same. I never got around to the question itself, but I guess the question itself is, are the elections in the United States fraudulent? Is it in my head, meaning is seeing one election system after the next go in a different way that goes against the exit votes? Am I crazy on that? Or is there something weird going on with the way the elections are being held in the United States?
When someone wants a particular election to be fraudulent, it will be fraudulent. And we have to remember, on any election, there are 90 to 100 questions on the ballot. Any one of those can be something that someone wants to control. And there are also locations that are more, let's say, open for business than others, where the powers that be know which places are open for business. Cuyahoga County in Ohio, Cleveland, Broward, Miami, Broward and Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach, very much so. There's a lot of big locations in the U.S. that are basically open for business. The fixers know where to go. They know who to ask. And on the local level, the same thing. Some of the things I looked at in terms of fraudulent elections really surprised me. For example, judicial elections. Elections for judges are one of the ones that are the strangest sometimes. A lot of these low profile elections that you don't pay too much attention to actually have, the sheriff election. Those things are dirty as can be. I mean, and then when you look back at the corruption of sheriffs, you realize that that's one of the most vulnerable positions. And even in the campaigns, I found 2 situations where sheriffs put out a hit on their opponent, and one of them actually killed his opponent. Yes, and that was in Atlanta. And he actually managed to put out a successful hit, had his opponent assassinated. Then he became sheriff. Then he eventually did get caught and sent to jail. I mean, so it's like, why would they not rig an election if they'll go as far as putting out a hit on their opponent?
You make a good point. People act as if the things that people do abroad, they won't necessarily do here. Again, I don't even know why that's true. So you would have a president put out, have these kill squads in the various countries or green light a war, but he wouldn't get his hands dirty on stuff in the States. It's like the guy's a brutal killer. Why do you believe that moral ineptitude doesn't necessarily translate into things that take place in the United States? I putting out a hit.
It does. And here's something I want to make sure that I get in this show, because it's really important. In terms of the electronic voting system and not being able to see whether it's true or not, we've actually solved that problem. And this is what's interesting. We've solved it. Doesn't cost any money. For the most part, doesn't take any new laws. And now what we're seeing is an absolute resistance to implementing the free and easy solution. And the solution is this. It's something on my website I call the Breaky Method. Break spelled like breaks, Brakey method.
Wait, before we get to
the new voting machines.
Before the solution, I do want to delve into one thing. How do you know that it's one thing for it to be off in a conceptual way where I can intuitively say, okay, there's something wrong with this process. And there's also something secondary in this kind of human faculty of, well, if I can't interrogate the result, then why do I trust the result? Just as a natural human method of, if you're telling me that you can't show me, like if it's not transparent, then why am I going to believe it? But how do you know? Like, it's different. It's one thing for me to think about it conceptually, or for me to implicitly think it. But how do you know? What's the thing? What's the thing that you're using to say, yes, this is definitely fraudulent? This is how we know it's fraudulent.
Oh, that's tough to do because the evidence is often destroyed. Bear in mind that in a court of law, spoliation of evidence you can take that to assume you're instructed. If someone spoils the evidence that's needed to know whether something happened or not, the instruction is often then assume the worst. You don't spoil all the evidence. A good example of this is there have been a couple of very suspicious elections in Broward County, Florida, for a candidate called Tim Canova against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. In the most recent election, he was capped at 5% in just about every location. He got the same amount of votes, which just doesn't happen in different demographics. But at the same time, when he took it to court and tried to get the records to look, the supervisor, against federal law, destroyed all the ballots. Now, that's spoliation of evidence, all right? If you say, okay, I just want to look, I'm going to look at the ballots, I got a court order to do so, and she says, oh, then I'm going to destroy them all. That's, in some cases, could be considered prima facie evidence of fraud. You either follow now
the ballots if there's nothing wrong with the ballots.
Right. And as I mentioned, there are solutions nowadays, and what election officials are doing is spoiling or destroying the evidence that's already available before anyone can look at it. Now, that's very diagnostic because there's most of the evidence is available at no cost to anybody, and they could go in under a public records request and go look for it. What I'm referring to is this. The voting machines, all the new ones, take a picture of every ballot as it's fed in. They take a photograph of it. So that's a public record, and you could get of course, that could be altered, right? But it's a public record, and you could just get a copy on CD or on a thumb drive of all the ballots and look at them. And that's been done in some of the more open counties that are willing to do that. You also have to correspondingly have the right to go and look at the ballots, the actual physical ballots, as a public record. And they have to be hooked together with a number or something. That's been done already. It's already available. And yet, when it became obvious that all these machines are taking pictures of the ballots, what did a lot of the election officials start doing? They started destroying the files. Now, that tells you pretty much what you need to know. There have been lawsuits. And so right now, The battleground is not so much on the technology front as on the legal front. There's a lot of litigation going on by courageous citizens in several different states to force them not to destroy the images, to force them to let them look at the ballots, so that anybody can look at anything. And the good news is some places, for example, Madison, Wisconsin, which is Dane County, is putting all those pictures of ballots on the web now.
Wow.
Humboldt County, California, you can just walk in and get a copy of all the ballots. And the first time they did that, people looked at them and found out that it had miscounted. So
Yeah.
this is a really hopeful thing. I don't, yes, the system's corrupt and we have a lot of corruption. We can't just throw up our hands. My brother's great for that. He'll go, yeah, it's all corrupt. Well, that's nice, but we have to. I think we have an obligation, if we're going to look for corruption, to also look for solutions. It is a human condition. People are going to do things they shouldn't do.
Now, what's
But
the solution? Now, what do
yeah,
you? So, because my thought is always paper ballots,
oh yeah, you have to have paper ballots.
and the ability to interrogate after the fact, meaning
Yes.
like recounts. One of those things that always, again, just intuitively, when you're looking at the process, and it's hard to get a recount. Let's do Jill Stein, for example. Jill Stein comes out and
Yes.
says, I want a recount. Hillary Clinton doesn't dare touch this. Now, I suspect the difficulty or the thing that you hit your head on here has to do with what they consider to be chaos. This is avoidance of chaos, even if it's
But that's another narrative.
right.
It's another narrative.
Even if it's maintained a lot. Because if you tell people that the electoral system is dodgy, then they don't necessarily have to accept the result of the electoral system, which means you have utter chaos. People saying, this is fraud. I don't believe this. I'm not buying into the system anymore. And you have people either pulling out of the electoral system, which drains energy from the political space, or just outright disbelieving the person who gets elected, which at that point, you're talking about, like, imagine a situation where Trump voters full well believe that Trump got elected, 20, 30, X number of millions of people, and a percentage of that may burn stuff to the ground because they don't necessarily like the fact that you've cheated their candidate. Like, if it's a touchy subject, and that's a hard rail to hit on, which is why I think media and politicians kind of stay away from that, which again allows it to be ripe for corruption.
It's only, though, remember, it only turns to chaos if you have an unaccountable system.
Yes.
If you have a system that's accountable and that anybody can look. Now, just imagine this. The photographs taken of every ballot, which don't have your name on them or anything, they're anonymous. They're put on the web right away as soon as they're scanned on election night. And anybody can look at anybody, not just a candidate, any person in the citizenry can look at any race and do 100% recount anytime they want. And then they can go and they can, under public records law, under freedom of information law, if they have a question as to whether those images are real, can say, I want to look at this subset, or I want to look at all the ballots. That's accountable.
If we're talking about digital, fudgery, can that be fudged also? I mean,
no, that's what I'm just saying. It only works if you also can look at the real ballots if you ask.
Yeah.
And now understand that you already, in many states, including most of the swing states, can go look at the ballots, and all you have to do is ask. It's free in most cases.
But for the recount, though, they tend to either charge more or try to hit
in a recount. Now, there's two different things. There's a recount or an audit. And I think Jill Stein actually asked for the wrong procedure. She asked for a recount when she should have asked for an audit. Because under the audit procedure, she would have been able to look at a lot of things they did not allow her to look at in the recount. And under the recount, the whole deal is I have 10 days and I'm going to call for a recount. And if I win, then I can become the candidate. Under an audit, we find out more likely, if all the materials are provided, whether the result that they announced is true or false. And I would contend that that's of more value. Even if the candidate was falsely installed, you at least know the system was false and you can do something. You're not continuing to just put false results out there. So, of course, what they're doing now is they're gaming the audit concept, and they're making that like something that doesn't mean anything either. Freedom of information law is the bottom core of sovereignty over your own government. And it applies to, quote, any person, In other words, any person, you, me, anybody, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, we already paid for those records through our tax money. We own them. We have a right to see them. And so now that the voting machines take a picture of the ballots and the ballots exist, you ought to be able to go and check both the pictures right away and the actual ballots anytime you want to. And that will tell you whether the system is counting correctly or not. And why I think this is really valuable is because they're fighting it so hard. Oh my goodness, they're fighting it. They're destroying them. They're telling people they can't look. They're breaking the law in order to not let people see.
How do we fix this? And so, my thought is always paper ballots. I tend to trust that
Absolutely.
and allow people to oversee the electoral process and the counting process. Like, make it as completely and utterly transparent, radical transparency. Because anything else, I think, allows a certain gaming. Like even the computer option. I'm a software, well, at least I used to be a software engineer, and it is a small feat to allow you to see whatever I want you to see.
Exactly.
In a computer space.
You can never just never just rely on computers.
Yeah.
Never, because somebody controls the computer.
Somebody controls the software. Like, so you go in, you do a vote, and on your website, you hit on this thing of fractional voting. Explain what fractional voting is before we finish. Well, two things. Solution, because that's my paper voting is just my baby, but I could be completely wrong, or at the very least, there could be more to it than just that. Maybe there's other ways around it. So solution, but also fractional voting, and maybe you want to transpose the order of those things. We're talking about fractional voting and then solution.
Well, actually, let me mention paper voting. You still have to be able to look at the ballots. What happened is a lot of states did say you have to have voting on paper, and at the same time, they outlawed anybody looking at the paper and recounts.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
This is why I'm saying it's diagnostic, isn't it?
Because recount is the lifeblood of your democracy. Now, lifeblood may be strong, but that's the thing. That's the thing that allows you to see whether or not that's the diagnostic on your democracy. Let's say it that way. Because at the end of the day, if you can't determine who voted for who and who is the leader of your particular country, then you don't have a democracy. You don't have a representative government under those terms. You have whatever people can buy.
So you have to have paper, but you always have to specify that because we know what they've done. It was interesting because I go way back, and back in 2004, we were fighting against all electronic, no paper. Well, you got to be careful what you ask for. We got paper, and then they said you can't look at it, and then they said you can't recount it unless you pay $1 billion, and then they put you through all these other hoops. So you have to say to be transparent, you got to kind of wall off those loopholes that they carve for themselves, and those loopholes instruct us that they are using. They're using the opportunity to control things, because why wouldn't they let us see it?
How do we fix it? How do we get an electoral system where there's integrity in the system and the people? Personally, I'm on this camp that I think people need to full well believe in the electoral system. I think it's a dangerous precedent when people don't believe in it. And if there's not transparency, there's not a reason to believe.
Exactly. You have to make it accountable to the public. And by that, I mean any member of the public, not just somebody from a political party. You have to make it accountable and transparent. And that is doable. But we have to address what the real problem is and stop saying it's rude and conspiracy thinking to think that someone might steal it. You have to say, look, we have to be able to see and authenticate our elections. The German decision is an excellent example. In Germany, they took it to the equivalent of the German Supreme Court, and the court had a beautiful ruling, and it said that the people must be able to see and authenticate every essential step of the election. Now, the people, meaning any person, must be able to see and authenticate each essential step. And they added one more thing: without need for special expertise.
That seems intuitive to me, though.
That's right. So why wouldn't we do it?
In any democratic order, because I don't think we can take too lightly what it means to go into a process of electing a person. I mean, ultimately, we're saying, because otherwise you have this kind of chaos of people fighting one another. It becomes this kind of civil conflict, as opposed to the political space, which is kind of a diffused political war. Like the two parties, if the two parties broke away, these would be two warring factions in a civil war. And to meld these differences within an electoral process, it takes individuals within the population. I think anybody, like the German decision, I think it's the most
Any person,
any
correct.
person. I think it's the most natural thing in the world to say that any random guy should be able to look at the electoral process and see that it's legit. And if he can't do that, then he's not crazy for having questions.
That's
Like
right.
full
And
well.
the any random person is two things. It's a deterrent because you see, you can control the one Democratic candidate, that might want to recount. They just did that in, I think it was Arizona, where they said, or New Mexico, I guess. Oh, they're not going to do a recount, but they're going to run for Senate next time. Well, you know what happened. They went behind the scenes and said, don't ask too many questions and we'll help you out for Senate next time. No, not just one person, not just a politically connected person, but any random person can go and look into it. That's a huge deterrent to fraud. Huge, because it takes away their ability to control the gateway points for it. And if you look at it, any person, we are the people who own the government. It's our money. So we do have that right. You asked me to talk about fractional counts a little bit. I call it fraction magic. That's something that was actually discovered in one of the primary voting systems, and apparently it migrated to the others, and all of the voting systems seem to have that now. And it's the capacity to count one vote as less than or more than one vote. So it's an instruction in the software to allow you to fractionalize and say, well, you're going to have 1.4 votes, and Bev is going to have 0.6 votes. It'll come out right because with two people, and that adds up to two, right? The fractional counting was put in there. They always have a reason. Now, I found this with embezzlement when I wrote about embezzlement too. The embezzler always has a reason why he wired something to his own account. You dismiss the reason and look at the effect. They said they needed to wait some elections. And then they came up with elections they would have to wait, like homeowners elections. And, he owns more property, so he gets more of a vote. And because of that, they put the capacity in every voting system to wait everyone's vote. Now, that is certainly unconstitutional, but it's still in there. And anybody who questions this is called a conspiracy theorist. Now, the reason it's so important that they put the ability to fractionalize votes in there is because if you want to do the most plausible type of election tampering, you need to account for demographics. You need to make the demographics in the precinct match up to their history, match up to expectations pretty precisely. If somebody is, and this is if you're not clumsily tampering with the election. For example, in 2008, in the primary, Obama got 0 votes in some Harlem precincts, which sounded a little odd to say the least. But if you're doing it not clumsily, you want to be able to say, well, okay, in these precincts, we're going to give this candidate, 49.2%. And in this one, we're going to give him 75 because that matches the demographics. To do that, you've got to be able to decimalize the votes. You don't know how many people are going to show up. So you've got to be able to allocate. And this is kind of complicated math stuff, but we have a video on YouTube called Fraction Magic that you can look it up and it kind of shows it. But if you have 100 votes and you're allocating ahead of time, I'm going to give Jamarl 43% here, and I'm going to give him 49% here and this and that. You don't know how many voters there's going to be, so you have to be able to count decimal votes and round it off to get that precise. Well, and so to put that into the voting system pretty much tells you that there is the capacity in there to mimic reality or to mimic public perception and yet create entirely false results.
If it was me, if I had to do it, I would probably, by percentage, I would say that that guy is going to have a really good election, but he's going to lose. He's going to get 48% of the vote.
Exactly.
And there are math functions that would automatically, round off. So if it's 47.1%, it would automatically round it off to the That's one.
But it would have to be able to accept the initial, because it's going to create decimals as it's doing those calculations with your algorithms. And so it has to be able to accept and process those. You see, you can set up databases so that they will not accept those decimals. And here's the problem. If you do that, you get these huge rounding errors where, where you get one off here and one off there, and pretty soon it's a whole bunch off. And then people start going, how come it's so far off? So you need to have decimals as it's doing its initial calculations, and only at the very end is it rounded off.
The Breaky Method. Now, what is the Breaky Method? I think that's the name that you were giving.
The Breaky Method is immediately, because they do, these voting machines that take a paper ballot, take a picture of it, put it on the web right away. And also, and this is the key, let anybody look at the actual ballots anytime they want. All right. So picture this. You're in Madison, Wisconsin. They put up, this precinct, and you go, I don't know if I really believe the result in that precinct. So you go and you look at all the ballots for that precinct. Well, they better look exactly like those pictures, right?
Yeah, ideally.
They better match. And if they don't, then something got rigged. It's as simple as that.
I see. I think I see what you're saying. Essentially, keep the machines, but if you take a snapshot of the vote, anybody can compare the vote itself to what is in the machine, in which case you can get some idea of whether or not the voting is reality or not. Now, two things. Most people don't necessarily check that. Like, they just make their vote, they're going with their business. You just kind of assume. The media looks at this and says, even if you showed it, like, meaning even if somebody comes out and says, hey, this election looks fraudulent, the media ignores this. Not just ignores this, like you said, it's conspiracy theory stuff. If it doesn't exist at all. So even going with a method like that, let me ask you this way. And I don't ask this with this idea that you completely, entirely know the answer to this question, but I'm curious about your response to this. How do you react to this when you can demonstrate it? Let's say a person gets elected, and then the person gets elected, the election looked weird in and of itself. You get your hands on the ballots and you see that there's a problem in the ballots. Maybe you see that your vote is wrong. Maybe you see that, wait a minute, I didn't vote for this person. How do you react to this when all of the mechanisms either try to ignore it or try to downplay it? And even if you can show that there's something dodgy about it, try to actively pretend as if there's nothing to see here, folks. How do you react?
That's why I'm doing your show. All right. The legacy media is, I think I would have to say, corrupted at this point. It is not telling us the truth. Here's a good example of this. I went and did an analysis of an election in Memphis that was very dodgy. And I found that there were 3,000 more votes than voters. And now this was from the election office in discovery. They provided the voter list of who voted and where and the number of votes. And there were 3,000 more votes than voters. Now that's an impossible number.
That's amazing. Wait. Just so I say that one more time. Where was this? What state? And you said there are 3,000 more voters. 3,000 more votes than were voters.
Yes, this was in the 2010 August election in Memphis, Tennessee. And there were 10 candidates that sued, and they asked me to come in and look at the records. And there was all kinds of dodgy things that were happening. But one of the very clear-cut examples was that we got the list of who had voted from the elections director and the list of the votes, and there were 3,000 more votes, 3,000 more votes than voters. Now, here's what the media did. Called us conspiracy theorists, said we were crazy. So I went to the reporter who wrote that. His name is Jackson, somebody or other, Memphis Flyer. I said, here are the records. Count them. You don't need special techniques. You need to just count. Wouldn't do it. Stuck to his story. We were crazy.
There's a story about a psychologist. Psychologist on an airplane. And the airplane sees a UFO. Like, everybody on the plane sees it. Everybody's like pressed to the window, like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. This thing is, beaming inside. And the plane lands, and they're interviewing people as they come off the plane, and they talk to psychologists. Did you see it? He's like, I don't believe in UFOs. It's like, I didn't look. I don't like, by definition of
I
my
won't look.
belief system.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean,
don't need to look.
but you know what we're seeing now is the legacy media is losing market share to independents. And that's because people kind of have a gut feel for truth, don't they?
They
They
do.
just know when something is just doesn't make sense and they're not buying it. And I think you see all these layoffs and you see how, well, it's not fair and people are, being against the First Amendment because they're not trusting what we say. No, 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 no. We need folks out there truth telling, and people will go to that, and those market shares will increase.
Yeah,
And what's so exciting about the new model is that, as it used to be, you have to have somebody to clean your desk for you, and you have somebody to, call a car for you in the morning and go there. The new model is so streamlined and so dispersed. It's real tough. They always say you can uh, deflect a column of ants that are all following one thing, but a swarm of bees is really hard to deal with. That's what we've got now with the new
just like
model of journalism.
eaten alive by 1,000 bees. Um, yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, what did they say? Like MSNBC, Fox, CNN, their
Oh, yeah.
average viewer is like 80 or 70 or something like that. Some it's like much older, like on their way out. And under 40 belongs essentially primarily online. And even those people who are 50s and 60s have started to migrate online themselves. So yes.
It's hard to justify. It's hard to justify watching the news on cable anymore. And, about the only thing is if there's some breaking event that they can get a camera to because nobody else has a camera there. But it's really hard. I think about it every month. Should I pay this bill? I don't watch it anymore because it's all steering us all down a cattle chute. And I don't care. I don't need to know. I don't need to be told I should trust someone or be told they're right. I want to make up my own mind. And it's okay if some information gets out that's not always correct. Look what we're being fed. It's not correct anyway. Let us learn our thinking powers again. And I think they really underestimate what we're capable of. So I think in terms of what do you do? There's two things that still sort of work. One is the court system sort of works in terms of some of the election litigation is working, especially the freedom of information litigation, where they're saying, do you have a right to destroy the ballots? The courts are ruling, no, you do not. You must keep them. Do you have the right to tell us we can't see them? In Colorado, there was an important case there. They even told the Secretary of State he couldn't look at the ballots. The court said, absolutely, anybody can look at the ballots.
That's
okay.
amazing.
Freedom of information. So the courts sometimes work particularly with freedom of information aspect, and independent media is the way to go in terms of getting the word out.
That's amazing. I feel you. I'm far darker on the prospects of this. Not necessarily as an absolute about everything, but the Tim Canova case, they destroyed the ballots.
Oh, thank
And
goodness.
the judge, said this is illegal by federal state law. This is illegal. This is not something that should be done. This is illegal. Brittany Snipes messed up when she did this. No consequence. In fact,
Right.
not just no consequence. Brittany Snipes was there to do the next election and botch that election also.
Yeah, she's finally gone. She's finally gone. As is the Palm Beach lady. She just got suspended as well. But it does take time, and some of these corrupt election officials, it can make a difference. I mean, I have seen cases over the years. I started out with a got to be replaced list where I just had a list of names on it, said get rid of these people. They usually replace themselves with somebody who's their crony, who's bad. Sometimes the third or fourth level replacement actually comes in and cleans it up. And what's happening down there is it's not even Brenda Snipes, it's the people underneath that are burrowed in there. They're sort of like the little election deep state, and they keep changing election people in Palm Beach and Broward, but they keep those people that are burrowed in. So it takes a few new administrations to clean it up, but it can make a difference. It's always, you have to look at it like a pendulum. It gets more corrupt, and then the ball starts going back toward less corrupt, and then it's going to get more corrupt again.
Here's the question, and I'm sorry, this interview is going long.
It's pretty interesting stuff, isn't it?
Well, it is interesting stuff. Was Bernie Sanders cheated? One, and why doesn't Bernie Sanders say anything about it? And I know all of this is going to be conjecture at some point. I'm just curious on your perspective.
Well, I was in California for that. That was the most obvious case I think we saw of all because they announced they announced the winner the night before, which was interesting. Chris Matthews on MSNBC said Hillary won. I was like, wait a minute. The California election, which is sort of the be all and end all, hasn't even been run yet. Um, and the other thing was with him, the absentee votes were so heavily tainted. You would see, for example, he would win 60% of the people who walk into the polls would vote for him, and in the same place, 60% of the absentee votes would go to Hillary.
Yeah.
There's a way to do that. Absentee, we're not going to get into that. I have a whole piece I've got to do on that because that's a whole new vector. Because you could have if you dump the wrong votes in there or withhold the actual votes or replace the votes because there's a chain of custody problem with that. But yeah, the Sanders was, certainly manipulated out of that nomination. He had the popular push behind him, but they used everything they could. They used the media, they used the rules, they used everything they could.
Now,
So I think, yeah.
why doesn't Sanders say anything? Now, I had my own ideas on why Sanders kind of just eats this and doesn't bring this up. Why doesn't he say anything? I mean, ultimately, if I was robbed, I think I would be entirely pissed. But by the same token, if I was a politician, there would be political realities that I would have to deal with, despite me being pissed about it.
Yeah.
Especially if it's one of those situations where I want an opportunity to do X. Meaning, if Sanders flipped out about this, would Sanders get the opportunity to run again in 2020?
Well, that's what they hold over their heads. There was an interview on Bill Still, but with Laura Presley from Texas, and she is a candidate who took it to court. She's like, I want to fight, and she's taken it all the way to the Texas Supreme Court. She's done brilliant work, but one of the points she makes is that candidates have got to fight back and stop getting suckered into, well, you can run again, because they hold that in front of the candidate as a carrot. And it's like, you can run again, or you can have this, committee chairmanship or whatever it is. And then they back off of their election contest. Of course. And we need more candidates. In fact, we should be asking candidates before the election, if you feel that procedures were not followed, or that the results don't make sense, will you contest this election? And if you won't, why should I put my money behind you? Why should I put my time behind you?
God, I love that. I love that. Like, one of the things that I did like about Tim Canova's thing is when he thought he was being cheated, he decided to run third party.
Yes. Isn't he? I mean, Tim Canova is a great, great example. I know it's been painful for him. I mean, I've talked to him many times. It's so painful. And he's like, well, why would I ever run again in this system? And it's like, what he has done is so important. He has exposed, it hasn't always solved, because what I think people don't realize, this is a deep, deep problem. This is more like the civil rights fight of the 60s. I mean, this is like getting out of Vietnam type of fight. I mean, this is not like, oh, if I just have a lawsuit, I can clean it up. It's a human rights fight.
I think it's even more important than that. I mean, let's be very clear here. We're talking, for the last 2 years, they've screamed at the height of their lungs that Russia has been attacking democracy itself, that it's, a foreign agent has been intervening into our politics. And Rachel Maddow has been losing her mind. And one of the last videos she did, Rachel Maddow comes out and she says, there's a cold snap in North Dakota and the Russians can turn off our power. What if they turn off our power? What if they turn off your power? The Russians may turn off your power. And you're like, wow, like that is amazing fear mongering. Saying that a foreign government may turn off our power and that people will freeze to death. Like they've been running with this narrative for the last 2 years. Now, what we're talking about are Facebook and Twitter ads, the majority of which took place after the election. And the stuff that they've been locking people up for had nothing to do with this idea of Trump colluding with Russia to hack anything. So this idea of attacking democracy itself. But to be fair, what you're talking about and what people dealing with election integrity issues are talking about is a direct attack on democracy. Like, this is one of those enemies, foreign and domestic things. This becomes a domestic issue if the public itself, who is supposed to be choosing the elected leaders of this country, don't have the ability to do that, or that ability is stunted in some way, because there are other people who want to get their guys in charge or in office. That is a dramatic issue. Like, nothing moves forward. Like, so any policy that lefties want, that tried to advance, none of that moves forward if the election system itself is being gamed. Even if you have the majority of the American public on your side for issue after issue after issue, if you can't get a fair electoral system where you know that the person who you're putting in office, like, this vote is this particular person, and I know that that vote got counted in that way, then it's a wash. Like this is a dramatically important issue. I find this. I don't take this issue lightly at all. That's why I full well like your notion, this idea that any politician that I'm supporting, I kind of want the politician to say that if I think something's wrong with the results, I'm going to challenge those results. I love that. I love that. I love that answer.
Yeah, well, with the stuff with the Russians, which is, yeah, it's a hoax in my opinion. But that whole thing, it's like it's the insiders, it's the domestics that that they're part of how it's done in this country. There was an old cartoon, Pogo, and he had a classic quote: "We have met the enemy, and he is us."
Yes, yes. I keep saying that. I'm like, it's not the goddamn Russians. You can look at even just in an overt way. This what is it? Interstate cross-check, where they were looking for specific nationalities or specific races because they knew those people has an outright chance of voting for the Democratic Party. In which case, they would scrub those people off the voting rolls. That is an amazing affront to any kind of democratic order in and of itself. And there was a thing. Mitch McConnell yesterday was talking about. They brought up voting on an off day, essentially a day off for elections. And he flipped out, oh, how dare they say they're trying to get people a day off when they go to vote. We don't want that at all. We want those people to have to go back to their jobs after spending, try to work in voting.
Yeah, and that's such a no-brainer. The voter registration and voter list thing is really thorny in the U.S. I looked at how other countries are doing it that seem to not have all these issues. England and Canada, and they do a national registration list where anytime you interact with the government,
it's like you're registered to vote.
Yeah, because the way we're doing it now, you do have these ridiculously messy voter lists. It's just crazy. Where I've looked at them, they have the same person on there 6, 7 times, and I'm not saying that that's because the person's going to vote 6 times. It's because they are just ridiculous. They don't clean the votes. They don't. The whole system is just flawed from a database perspective. You have to have an identifier that's a unique identifier, like our social. It doesn't really belong in the voter list, but you have to have some method of identifying each individual and some method, if it's a national election, of having a national voter list, I think.
What would be wrong is if the moment that the person is born, the moment the person is registered to vote, like just by virtue of your birth.
Well, yeah, now you get a social security number the moment you're born. And so it's the same time. Yeah. And then but the difference is how the problem is in updating that list. It's a really thorny problem. I know. I mean, I've moved from an apartment, at some point I don't notify the voter registration bureau, hey, I moved, the countries that seem to have it together have it set up so that any other interaction with the government updates that address, because you can't have a person who's the reason they'll say, well, there's, way more people on the voter list than there is population in that county. That's true because people move and they never update it. Yeah. And there's not a mechanism for updating it. And so it's a mess. I have the Memphis voting list and they are a mess. They're just a mess. And it's because the laws don't even permit them to clean it up very well. They don't make sense. The law says, to clean it up after the person didn't vote for 6 years, you send them a postcard at the old address. It's like, what? This is the most ridiculous concept. So, we don't do that in any other country. So I think we just have a messed up way of doing the list. And of course they game it then politically.
Yeah, I suspect that part of the reason they keep their list that way is game it.
Oh, yeah.
I think allow themselves to game it. All right,
Yep.
I'm going to end this here. I really do appreciate you coming onto the show. Is there anything you want to tell the audience before I always leave this as an open question to the guests to, say whatever they want to say that I didn't get a chance to ask?
Listen, the thing I want to tell the audience is to make a concerted effort to find sites like yours and others that you find are credible and that are valuable and that have unique thought. Because I think we're not ever going to actually win this thing unless we can deal with the public information aspect of it. And it has to get crowdsourced.
Okay, fair enough. I agree with you. I think it takes a village to fix something like this. Taking it to the courts. I think, like you said, the court systems to some degree works
Mhm.
on this, and they've been trying to work on this. The political space, like I know courts, so sometimes they don't necessarily get their hands in electoral politics. Um, but it becomes this thing of how do we, I guess it's an open question to me how this gets fixed. And I don't know the answer to how this gets fixed outside of, large majorities of people
Yeah.
demanding that it get fixed.
And there's going to be a suite of solutions. Not one magic wand. There'll be a suite of solutions that this works for this and this works for that. But uh, we need to keep working on it. If we're not working on it, then we're just basically becoming
Acceptable.
vassal. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
All
All right.
right. Thank you so much.
Bev Harris, Blackbox Voting, and there's also bevharris.com, which goes more into, I guess, issues of fraud or corruption.
Correct.
So thank you very much for coming on to the show.
All right. So long.
Have a good one, guys. All right. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You guys can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all. And we are off.